What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over upgrading our input mapping, input binding controls menu. So long time ago in this series we made a menu that did not look like it does today. I'll open this up, show it to you. So in the previous episode on this, what we had done is we had just boxes with buttons. You could click on them and you could rebind them to be specific values by pressing the key. So if I were to click on this manually, I can press a button like W on the keyboard, and now my jump is bound to the W key. This worked. It actually did rebind the key, and that's great. But there's a few things that we need to update today and in another episode to get this widget really working the way we want it to. So first things first, we had no actual keyboard or gamepad control over this widget, so it would only work with clicking on the input manually. Okay, we want to be able to move the option that we're selecting by a button on the keyboard or on the gamepad. So we're going to be able to control them today. We're also adding it to an actual menu in the game, because before this point we never had it in a menu. We only ever had it as a pop-up window in the level blueprint. I was actually just spawning it and using it right from there while the game was running. So now I'm adding it to the settings menu. So we've got to go to this little screen, come in here, change our inputs. Now I actually am not going over a better binding system for this today. We do have a slightly better binding system that I want to implement in the next episode on this topic, but I'm not going to be covering that today because it is a little bit more advanced than the rest of the stuff I have in today's episode. So I wanted to get it in this menu, add the ability to switch between tabs within the settings menu, and then also start utilizing this. We still have a lot to do, mainly because I want to bind macros. I want to be able to bind macros, and macros will require multiple inputs, not just one. So I don't want to go down that rabbit hole today. That is for the next episode. But you will be able to put this widget in the settings menu today and actually start utilizing it instead of just spawning it randomly in the world. So in case you want to play around with your bindings, you'll be able to do that today. Alright guys, before we get started, I want to thank everyone who has helped make this project possible so far. That includes you guys as the subscribers, that includes the Patreon members and YouTube membership subscribers. Thank you guys for all the love and support. I am so incredibly excited to work on this every single week, and I'm glad you guys are too. It's just a really fun project, and I just wanted to say thank you for all the support. Now, if you want to get caught up in the series and check out everything we've done to this point, you can go ahead and click this iCard in the top right corner right here. I'll bring you to the entire playlist. It'll show you every episode that we've ever done for this and everything that we've used to get to this point in the series. Alternatively, if you don't care about all of that, but you do care about the input remapping, I do have the initial episode here that I'll link in the top right corner, so you can check out everything we've done to get the boxes working, the inputs being mapped. And while we're improving it today, we are still building off of a lot of the logic that we already had, so it could be very useful for you to watch that video if you haven't already. Alright, and with that said, we can go ahead and get started. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is just take a look at the change control screen, and I'm going to show you what I did because I made it look a lot nicer. It's not necessarily nice looking right now, it's just a black background, but before it was literally just gray buttons and text over top of nothing. So it's a big upgrade from that. We'll continue to improve it as time goes on. But if you go to your widget, mine is called change control screen, so you might have named yours something similar if you don't remember what it was called, because it was quite a long time ago. So what I've done is I've changed the title from options to controls because I did not want to make it more confusing. We have the gameplay options here on the settings screen. So I'd recommend opening up the settings screen as well. So I changed options to controls, and I've added two little buttons here. that I've put an image on, and they're like little arrows. So it's essentially saying I can click these to go to a different topic. In the settings screen, I also added this gameplay title as well as 2 buttons. So technically, I'm not changing anything on the actual settings screen to go between tabs. I'm going to be pressing these buttons to remove the settings screen and then open up the controls tab. So in a way, we're basically faking tabs by having separate widgets, and when we press one, it removes the old widget and spawns the new one. But there's actually nothing wrong with this. We'll keep all of our data when we press confirm on these options, or if we have like a save changes. When that gets pressed, we'll keep all of our data. So if we switch tabs, any persistent data that we had on this menu will go away unless we intend to keep it, which is also okay, because if we made no changes, then we don't care about any of the data that we went over and selected. Another thing that I should have done that I did not, and I'm going to do now, is I should copy the settings text from the settings screen and paste it in the canvas panel on the change control screen. Also want to grab any of the values here and move them. So position X is 40, position Y is 20. So this will actually put them at the same spot on each widget. So settings is persistent. So you can see that I know that I'm still in the settings menu, but I'm on a different tab. It's essentially what we're going for here. You can design this however you want. It's not super important, but I would recommend either having a scroll box so you can scroll down here and get to your control mapping, or an entirely different widget like I have so that you can switch pages and see your controls here. But however you do it, now you see how I've set mine up. I've added a back button, which again is also copied from the settings screen. So you can go ahead and copy your back button logic onto your change control screen. And then I've also made this look a little bit better, because instead of just having these as floating values in the middle of the screen, I have the name of the command, and then I have the input key selector. So this is what we can press on and then set the key. I had them in a horizontal box and I had them all in a vertical box, so they're all going to be evenly spaced in here. So let's cover how I did this. I added a vertical box to the screen. Okay, just brought that in there. Once I've done that, I've added horizontal boxes for each of the commands. So jump horizontal box, attack 1 horizontal box, attack 2, attack 3, attack 4, and I've added a crouch today. Then I took what we already had, the text, the actual text areas of all of the sections. So for each input mapping name. And the binding. We had these input key selectors, which is something else you can also look for. Input key selector. So we have the name and the input key selector in each of our horizontal boxes. This way I can add as many as I want to this vertical box, and I can technically move them around as well. So if at any point I want to move them and change the order, I can. Vertical boxes and horizontal boxes are super cool, and I love them. This cleans it up a lot, as opposed to just having some random floating text and input key selectors. But you don't have to do it this way. However you set it up and however you design it is perfectly fine. I do like to show you my entire process, so that's why I went over it. And if you'd like to look at my details on my horizontal boxes, this is what I have. For my text, this is what I have. And for my bindings, this is what I have. I have changed the text style to change the color to white, and also to add outline settings. So there's a lot of stuff in here. You don't have to look at all this. I'm just showing you if you really want to look at all my settings, just so you know you're not missing anything. That's everything I got. Okay, you'll know if I changed it because it'll have the little yellow arrow next to it. Now some of these things that you see that have the little yellow arrow next to it are things we've covered in the last episode of this, like allowing gamepad keys. So you don't have to worry about them. All I did was design changes when it came to this stuff. At this point, you should have something like this, or however you designed it. Again, you'll probably make yours look a lot nicer than mine, but that's okay. However you want to have it in here is good. But now that we have it a little bit better looking and we're ready to implement it into our settings screen, we're going to have to add these buttons as our little category or tab changers on our settings menu and on our change control screen menu. So if you add buttons to each of these menus for these, I call them left category selector and right category selector. They're quite literally just buttons. Not a special thing, they're just buttons. And I've changed their style to this specific style that I have. Adjust that real quick. Little error on my part because I forgot to change that to an image. But essentially I have 3 different colors of an arrow. So if it's normal, not hovered, it looks like this. If it's hovered by the mouse, it looks like this. And if it's pressed by the mouse, it looks like this. Right now I'm doing this all through the mouse because I have an upgraded version I want to show you in the next episode, but it's not ready yet. And so I'm doing everything through the mouse. These can stay, because if you ever want to allow mouse control, then perfect, here you go. But I also want to allow gamepad and keyboard control. So we're not quite done with this yet. We'll revisit this more in the next episode on this topic. But I set up these 3 images. That's all. I'm just using my mouse controls here so that I can show you that I'm hovering it and pressing it. So these are just buttons with images. That's all they are. It's actually not as confusing as it looks. It's not a special type of input or anything like that. But make sure you go all the way down to the bottom to events and press or click on pressed, the little plus button next to it, and it'll bring you to an event that it creates in the graph. Now you're going to do this for both the left and the right. Once you do that, you'll have 2 events, one called left category selector and right category selector, or whatever it is that you called your buttons. Now, right now, we only have 2 screens we can change between, so this is super simple. But in theory, you'll have multiple screens you can change between, and so you might have to add different variables to keep track of what screen you're on or what screen you should be going to next. For now, it's about as simple as can be. What we want to do is when we are on the settings screen, if we press one of these buttons, we want to go to the change controls screen widget. So we need to create it and add it to the viewport. Then we also need to remove the settings screen whenever we press either of these buttons. Now to do this, we can right click and say create widget. And then we want to go to select class and we want to search for the widget that we're trying to create, or you can just find it in the list, which is the change control screen. It's this widget right here. Now there's something else going on in here, and this is my creator widget reference. So creator widget reference was something we set on the settings screen, and it kept track of who spawned this widget. This is important because the main menu could spawn the widget for the settings, but also you could spawn it in-game from the pause menu. And depending on what we do there, the logic might change a little bit. So this creator widget reference is one that we already have in the settings menu. We need to create one in our change control screen widget. So without looking at any of this logic right now, we'll get into this in a few minutes. If you make a new variable, you're going to want to make it either a widget reference, just directly widget, or a main menu screen. Right now we can make it a main menu screen because we don't have the ability to go here from the settings, but we will, and so we'll need it to be more global, more generic than a main menu screen specifically. But this will work for now because this is just setting up the logic. We'll obviously talk about that and just change this variable type when we get there. It's super simple. It won't take us more than about a minute to do once we get there. Regardless, we need a variable now. So I'm going to call it creator widget reference. I'm going to set it to the main menu screen, and I want it to be an object reference. Then I want to go to my settings screen. I want to grab the creator widget reference from the settings screen and get it. Then I want to drag off the change control screen widget and then find creator widget reference and set it on here. We're taking the one from the settings screen and then we're going to set the one on the change control screen using this value. So that's what you see going on here. We're just passing that data along. Since we are removing the settings screen, we do need to keep track of who spawned this widget, whether it be the main menu, the pause menu, or somewhere else even. And so that's what you're seeing happen here. I'm just transferring that data, then I'm adding the change control screen to the viewport, and then I'm removing the settings screen. That's the only logical change we have to make in the settings screen today. So if your stuff looks good, you know, you're happy with your settings screen, you can go to your change control screen. Now here we're going to do the same thing. Make sure that your left and your right category selectors, whatever you're calling these buttons, have onPressed event added to the graph. Then in here, we can go down and find those. We have left category, right category selector. And we're going to do essentially the exact opposite of what we just did. We want to create the settings screen widget this time. So, same process. If we go create widget, then we go to select class and find the settings screen. Okay. Once we have this, we need to do what? We need to add it to the viewport, and then we're going to remove the change control screen widget. We're going back to the settings screen widget now. But again, since we're removing the screen that had the creator widget reference, we need to pass that data along. So let's do it one more time. We take our create settings screen widget. Then we're setting the change control screen creator widget reference to the settings screen creator widget reference. So we're passing that data along back to this widget. Then we're adding it to the viewport so it becomes the front and what the player sees. Then we're removing the old one in the background so we don't have the change control screen open anymore. Okay, all of these bind new keys that you see here are old logic. They're staying, they're not going anywhere, but nothing we have to talk about with them. Let's go to event construct of the change control screen. Now, in event construct, you had all of this logic before. Everything highlighted here. I'm not even going to look at it all or go over it all because we have that whole episode on that. All I did is move this over. I haven't changed any of it. I've just moved it over so I can add our menu navigation in right here. Everything highlighted now is new, so we have to make all of this logic. Something I'd recommend doing here is going into your bind new key function, which is the function we made in the previous episode of the change control screen, and disconnecting it. Just the for loop here, everything can stay. We want all this logic to stay. I've just disconnected this so that nothing happens. This is because I don't want to actually be changing all my input actions and input axes in my project settings. If I do, it gets really ugly, and then my controls are actually changed, and I have to go through and bind them again. When working on this and not actually using it as the player, we don't want to continuously change our controls. It's very annoying to have to do that every time because it does physically change the binding. So it changes us for those using it in the editor as well. Now, we need to do our standard menu navigation logic here, but this one I've kept simpler than most because we have some different things we're going to have to add for the input key selectors that are more specific. So I tried to keep everything as basic as I could while still accomplishing everything we would need on this menu. With that said, we have to add two variables. So you can add variable. We're going to add current P1 selection, or you could just call it current selection if you have no intention to ever have player 2 on this menu. And we need max selections. So current P1 selection is, as always with our menus and our menu navigation, it's going to be the integer index of the row or column that we're on. In this case, everything's up and down. I don't really have a left and right. Left and right might change tabs or something similar. But for now, I only have up and down on this menu. So current P1 selection is going to keep track of the row that we are on. To give you an example, jump would be row 0, light attack row 1, medium row 2, heavy row 3, special row 4, crouch, row 5, back, row 6. Max selections is the maximum number of selections we have. So I went from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, which means we have 7 selections. 0 through 6 is 7. So these are both integers. One keeps track of the current value we're on, one keeps track of the max. Now, we usually set max by simply compiling after making the variable, scrolling down the details panel to the default value, and setting it to a hard-coded value, such as 7. But there is also an automatic way to get this if you'd like to use that method, so I'm showing that here. I take my input bindings vertical box. My vertical box that I added to the screen earlier in the episode, or before the episode really, but that I showed you earlier in the episode, I made it a variable by checking is variable over here in the details panel. And so I'm able to grab it in the graph using the name of the vertical box. So I can drag it on the screen and get it. I can get all the children in it. Note that the children, in this case, if you call get children count off the vertical box, it returns the children that are at the highest level. Okay, so the vertical box only has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 children. It's got 1 for each input mapping. Now, there are more elements in here, like there's the text, and then there's the input key selector. But it doesn't go through all of those. It's just picking up the highest level, which are all the horizontal boxes. So if you get the children count, you could set that to max selections. Because I also want to be able to navigate to the back button, I know I automatically have to add 1 to this for it to be the true value. So then I just drag off of this, press plus or add, and you're going to want to do integer plus integer. Leave it at 1, so plus 1. And then you can set max selections to this value. Now this is perfectly good to do, and it's pretty cool because now you can add more children to it and max selections will always be correct. However, we do need to grab the specific objects we're on anyway when we're binding the keys. So you will have to keep track of all each index manually in the logic, so you will eventually know how many you have regardless. It's up to you if you want to try and play with that, because you definitely can use this and make it work. Or if you just want to go down to default value and set it to 7, or however many you have at the moment. Either way, at this point, max selections should be set. As you add more to this vertical box, you need to make sure you increase it if you're setting it manually, or decrease it if you're taking them away. Now, we need to actually add the navigation logic. So there's a few functions we have for this. We have our move selection function, which tracks when we actually move up and down in this widget. Then we have determine widget to focus, which allows us to figure out what button or which widget we are actually on. Remember, these aren't technically buttons, these are input key selectors. So they are a different class. So it determines what widget we are focusing within this widget. I know it can be confusing, but basically it determines if we're on one of these or if we're on the back button. We need to know that, and that's exactly what determine widget to focus will do. Then display focus widget is what shows that to the user by changing the style of the input key selector or button to be that highlight or that blue color that you see. That way you know this is the one we are currently on. Lastly, we have confirm selection, which is when we press the confirm button, what do we actually do with the selection that we are on? So let's start with the move selection function. You can make them all now or make them one at a time. Just click add function, call it move selection, and go into that function as soon as you can. Now, if you click on the function, either in the list or the actual initial node here, and go to the details panel, you'll have inputs and output parameters. We're going to have 2 input parameters that we're going to use today. So if you click plus new parameter, I've added 2. I have one called direction and one called play sound effects. So direction is an integer, and it's going to be basically a -1 or a 1. It's just going to determine if we're moving up or down. Play sound effects is going to keep track of if we should play the sound effects or not. There are a few reasons you may not want to, like if they're muted, or also if you're manually moving it to a specific value, like when you open the screen the first time, and you don't want to play the move sound effect. Once you've added these two variables, we can now go through the logic and move selection. So we're going to take current P1 selection, which defaults to 0, the initial value, or the topmost value in our case. And we're going to add the direction to it, the direction that's coming into this function. So if we do current P1 selection plus and pass in direction, we have to determine if this is greater than the minimum but less than the maximum. So we do integer greater than integer. And then we're also going to use it for integer less than integer. Now, you can see that I have this up here, right? So current P1 selection plus direction. And we have, it's greater than -1. So greater than -1. -1 is our minimum value. In fact, it's one below our minimum value. We can't go to -1. 0 is our minimum value. However, direction can be -1, right? Direction, like I said earlier, is -1 or +1. -1 if we're going up, +1 if we're going down. So if current P1 selection is 0 and we add a -1 value to it, that's going to be -1. That's not a valid index. That's below the minimum. Okay, so it's got to be greater than -1 if we actually want to do this move. Otherwise, it has to be less than the maximum. So say current P1 selection is 7. Max selections default value is 7. So if current P1 selection is 7, we're on the back button already, and we press down, we're trying to add 1 to it. That would make it 8. Well, we can't go to 8 because there's only 7 selections. So this has to be the max. But instead of hard coding it here, you can pass in max selections. All right, then you can drag off of these booleans and type and boolean and pass them both in. This is how I got what I have here. Now, this and boolean is going to go into a branch, and only if it's true are we going to actually move the selection. Because if either of these fail, that means we're either below the minimum or above the maximum, in which case we don't want to move the selection. But if it is true, it means we're within the valid range of movement on our menu. And so we take the addition here. We take the return result of that, and we pass it back to itself. We set current P1 selection equal to current P1 selection plus direction. Now, since we moved, we want to determine which widget we should be focusing at this point. So we'll make this function and fill it out. So go ahead and add a new function, call it determine widget to focus, and then go into it. For this function, what we have to do is use the current P1 selection, or the selection that we are on, and then we need to determine what button or what widget would be focused based on that index. So I use current P1 selection, I get it, and then I pull off of it and perform a switch on int. You can add as many pins as you want. You're going to want to add one for every single selection. So I have 0 through 6, or again, 7 selections. You also have a default, which is if this value does not fit within this range, what do you want to do? We're going to go to a default of the back button, or the last option anyway. So once you get the switch on integer, we're going to return the widget that we should be focusing. Basically, returning it grabs us the value so that we can give it to something else. We retrieve the value and we want to pass it to something else. To do this, we need an output parameter. So again, click on your function or the purple node here. Go to your details panel, scroll down to your outputs. You can add a new parameter here, and we're going to make it a very basic type called widget. We want just widget, and we want it to be an object reference. The reason we're making it a widget and not a button or an input key selector is because the back button is a regular button. These other ones are input key selectors. They are not the same, and if you try and use just one, you won't be able to compile. You won't be able to pass them all into this return node. But if you use a higher class, such as just the widget, then you will actually be able to do it. Okay, so we have widget, and I called it widget ref. Now, switch statement. We're basically doing a manual bind here to say index 0 or row 0 is what? I'm saying it is the jump binding. All your bindings here will be variables, as we set up in the previous episode. If they're not, make sure you make them that way. I believe they start this way by default anyway, but just make sure they are all set to is variable. What we're going to do is use them to return from this function. So current P1 selection of 0 is going to be my jump. Selection of 1 would be my attack 1. 2 would be attack 2. 3 would be attack 3. 4 would be attack 4. 5 would be crouch. And you can see I can click on them and I can actually see exactly what it's bound to. Right? This is the attack 2 binding. This is the attack 3 binding. So it's literally that simple. I can just bring them in here and get them. Then I want to use return node or add return node and then just pass it into that. This is the same process for all of these from jump to crouch. The back button, however, is slightly different. It's not a binding, so you just actually have to find your back button here. Get that, and then pass that into a return node. But it will work all the same since we're using a standard widget and not a specific class under it. So now we're returning the appropriate actual widget that we're on. So if we go back to move selection, make sure we're calling this function if you're not already. I know we just made it. So make sure you call it after setting current P1 selection. Since we gave it that widget reference, we can actually capture this value and pass it to something else. So we have widget reference, and we want to pass it to a new function. And I've called that display focused widget. So let's create that one and go into that one now. So make a new function, go into it. It needs a parameter for you to pass things into it. So when you create it, you won't have that ability. But we're going to pass it the focused widget. So as usual now, make a new input parameter. Make it a widget again. It's going to be object reference. I've called this one focused widget. This function is all about changing the actual visuals of the widgets to make sure that the player understands that this is the selected one or the one that they are hovering. That's very important so that they know where they are on the menu. We can take our focused widget that was passed into this function, and we could check it for validity. It should never be invalid at this point, but if you get into more complicated widgets where some things are spawning and despawning as you're selecting different options, it is possible that the last selected widget would be invalid, and so it's not a bad idea to actually check and make sure it is valid. So if you drag off focus widget, you can do is valid, and you want the question mark in this case, and just bring the white line through, and that'll automatically do that for you. As long as it's valid, we can continue. So the reason this is pretty ugly is because depending on what type of widget it is, we may have to do things differently. Here we have to set the styles differently because an input key selector style is not the same as a button style. So to change these to look how we want them to look when they're hovered, like again how these turn blue when I change the value in the game. So if we go back down to it, see, the blue one here is the one that I am currently selecting, right? And I can do the same for the back button. The button is different than the input key selectors, so we can't use the same style. What we have to do is take the focused widget and determine what type of widget it is now. Now we have to know the more specific type. So we can cast to an input key selector. Okay. And we can also cast to a button. Let's do the input key selector first. So you get this node here. If this succeeds the top node here, that means that this is an input key selector. This is not our back button. This is one of these buttons. So now what we have to do is determine which one we are on. We do know which one we are on because we just figured it out from the determine widget to focus. But we also have to reset all the ones we are not on, because if we were previously on the jump and it was light blue and we go to light attack, great, we should turn that to light blue, but we should also reset the jump back to the gray color. We're no longer highlighting that, we're no longer hovering that one. We need to take this value right here, the return from this cast, and we need to compare it to all of our bindings here so that we know what to do with all of them. Which one should be reset, which one should be made that hovered or selected color. An easy way to do this is to just add them all to an array and loop through it and check against each one of them. So we're going to do just that. I'm going to grab all my bindings. I was just bringing them onto the screen and getting them. And I got all these guys here. And then I call for a node make array. We can actually make an array and pass it data. So you can take the jump binding, for example, pass it in, and then add a pin and say attack 1 binding, add a pin. You can keep adding these pins as much as you want. Once you have all your bindings in here, or all of your widgets of this type is the main thing in here, then we have our full array. So at this point we can take the array and we can bring it into a for each loop. And that's what we did here. Now, for each loop is going to go through this array and look at every single element. We need to look at the current element in the loop and compare it to this cast. So we're comparing it to the widget that we should be focusing. If they are not the same, that means we are not focusing the widget that we're currently looking at in this loop, meaning that it should not be the selected color, but the default gray color. So we drag off of array element and type not equal. You'll get this. It's an exclamation mark and an equal sign. The other thing we pass into it is the return from the cast node here. If it's true that they're not equal, like I said, that means we're not selecting it. So we want to take our array element and call it set style. Then we can right click on widget style and split struct pin to open it up a bit. And you can set as many or as little of these as you want. For me, I'm just going to use the widget style normal because at this point, when I'm using my menu or gamepad navigation, I'm not going to have actual physical hovers like with the mouse, but instead they will be all done with the controllers and the keyboard. So I'm going to split widget style normal. And I want to select my gray button, which is button bar 1 for me. I'm also going to draw it as a box because that's just what looked better for those input key selectors in my opinion, but you can do whatever. Just make sure that your style matches your standard style here. Okay, whatever you have here basically is what you should be filling out there. Great. Now you've set the input key selectors we're not currently on back to the gray color. In the case of false, that means that this array element does equal this cast, meaning that is the widget that we are selecting. In that case, we want to still do the same thing. You can copy your set style. Make sure you plug your array element into the target here. But this time, the image is not going to be the button var 1. It's going to be our blue image, or whatever our hover or selected image is. For me, it's called BTN P1 hover var 1. So now we're able to set the input key selectors to the proper style based on if we're selecting it or not. Perfect. There's something else we have to do after this, but I'll explain that in a second. It'll make more sense once we do the other section, the button section. So now let's back up for a second. Let's go back to our cast node. Assuming the cast of the input key selector fails, we go to cast failed, which I have all the way down here, just so it's a little bit cleaner. And instead, I'm taking that same focused widget, and I'm bringing it down here as well, and I'm casting it to a button now. So we tried casting it to input key selector. It failed, so now we're going to cast that same object to a button. If it succeeds, we know that we're on a button now. I only have one button, so I'm using one specific check here. But if you have multiple buttons as well, like a save changes or a remap all or something like that, then you might want to use the make array method and just pass all your buttons into it and loop through them. Since I only have the back button, I'm just checking if the cast result of the button is not equal to the back button. If it's true that it's not equal, we reset it to the standard button image, the button var1. But if it's false, meaning that they are equal, we should set it to the selected or hovered button image, which is the btnp1 hover var1. It's really a variation, but I'm calling it var because it just sounds better than var. Okay, and with that, make sure that the actual one you're changing here is the one from the cast, not the back button. You could use the back button here and get the right result, but this would only work when you have only one button here. I set this up intentionally like this, so if we add more buttons, it'll scale and it'll work still. So make sure you're using the cast off the button for the target on these widget set styles. Now note, if you tried to copy them from the input key selector styles, it would not work because the styles are different. So you have to drag off the button and say set style. And then same process, split the struct pin again. Now these extra nodes I have after are because since we have some on the input key selector and some on the button, if we were previously on an input key selector, for example, be crouch input key selector, and we press down, we go to back. Well, now we're going to fail the cast for the input key selector, and we're going to go to the button, which means we're never going to reset the style for the previous input key selector. Same goes for the button. If we go from the button back up to crouch, then we're never going to reset the button style. So on each section, we have to reset the other. So if we're on an input key selector, we basically want to reset all buttons. We know we're not highlighting or hovering any buttons right now. So the button is easy because I only have one. So I manually just grab the back button, call set style, and set it to the default yet again. Okay, you can essentially use your third set style here, copy it, paste it here, and then manually use the back button this time. Now, if we have an array, so either more buttons or our input bindings, when we're casting to our button, we need to reset them, okay? Notice that all the branches, no matter what method we went, if we were true or false, we then reset them. Which I'm actually just realizing this is not the best method to do it. This is perfectly fine, but instead we should actually do this on a completed because we don't need to reset it every time. That is my fault. So I'm going to show you doing that now. So I'm going from completed of the for each loop into this right here. Okay, so once we're done going through all of our input key selectors, we'll go through and we'll clean up the buttons and reset the style. Now the same is true for this one as well. In this case, it's actually fine. We don't have to change anything because I'm not looping. But again, if we get more buttons in here and we add a loop, then we'll just do the same process. So once we are done checking the buttons, setting the style appropriately, we need to reset the input key selectors. We're on a button, so we know none of the input key selectors are currently selected. So what I've done is actually just make an array again. I've just copied what I had up here. I then pasted it, looped through them, and for each one, I reset the style of the input key selector back to my default style. And at this point, we're looking pretty good. We're actually able to determine which one we're on and display that. Make sure you go back to Move Selection. And now that we have Display Focus Widget done, pass the widget reference into Focus Widget if you haven't already done that. Now the last thing I have here is super simple, and you've seen this before if you've been following the series. I use my Play Sound Effects boolean, just bring it all the way to the end, bring it into a branch, and if it's true, I play a sound 2D. And I just have a hard-coded back out sound right now because I don't know if these are going to be the final sounds that I use for these. But you can play whatever sound effect you want. And move selection is done. So that's all of our functions done except for confirm selection. Let's go into the event graph before we cover confirm selection. And let's start setting this up so you can test it. I already covered this earlier, so let's skip to here. Now what we need to do is perform a listen for input action node for each of the options that we have. The players can move up and down in the menu, so we know we need an up and a down. We're going to also need a confirm because they can select options on the menu, and we need a back because they can press back to return to the main menu or the pause menu, whatever it may be. It's actually pretty simple. We've done this a lot. We have listen for input action, and we're going to grab all of our input actions that we need. Now, you could either do this, or you could use the player controller method that we showed off in the command list in the pause menu. Either method will work here. We need to type in the action name that we want to listen for. In this case, I already know it's menu up P1, menu down P1 for me, but you can always go to your inputs, your edit, project settings, inputs, and then look at your menu controls. Or if you don't have separate controls, just look at the corresponding control, such as jump P1. I type in my action name here, so I find it, and then I have this callback, which is the event that's going to be called or triggered once that action name, the action mapping with that name, has fired. So off the callback, you can drag off of it and type add custom event. And once you do that, you'll get an event here, and you rename it to whatever you want. So I just usually call it something similar. So P1 menu up. Then I have one for menu down P1, so I make P1 menu down. Menu confirm P1, so I make P1 menu confirm. And lastly, return P1, which is P1 back. Now, if we go back to the start, menu up P1. When we press up, what we want to do is call move selection. So you can bring your move selection node in here. You have to manually put in the direction. If we're moving up, that is a negative, so we want -1. Since this is manual movement done by the player, we do want to play the sound effects. You can copy this for menu down. Menu down, since it's moving down, it's going to be a +1, so get rid of that negative. And it's another manual input by the player, so we are going to play sound effects. Now, confirm we'll talk about in a second, so we can skip that one for now. Let's go to the back button. So P1 back, or using the mouse to click the back button also works. Just make sure you click on the back button, scroll all the way down the details to on pressed, and add it. Once you do that, you will have the ability to have on pressed or the actual return button that we have. The return button's like a B button on a controller, like get out of this menu, but you can also manually go and click or select the back button on the widget as well to go back. So either of these will do the same thing. Now what I'm doing here looks a little complicated, more so than it should, but really it's actually pretty simple. We did the exact same thing in our settings screen, so if you'd like, you can go to your settings screen and copy it node for node. But I'll give you a quick rundown. So the creator widget reference, this is our main menu currently, but it's intended to be our main menu or a pause menu, wherever our settings menu could be. We have a boolean is settings menu open. This is used for several things within our main menu. It's used for keeping track of what inputs should be moving and different data that we need to be displaying. We want to disable this because at this point it's not going to be open anymore. If we're pressing back, we're exiting back to the main menu. Then I have resume listening for confirm. Different inputs, our listen for input actions can be enabled and disabled. Sometimes we want to disable them, such as when we have submenus. So we had a function in the main menu called resume listening for confirm. We're just calling that again so that we can tell the main menu to focus again on it being the main widget, not a submenu. I play a sound effect when we back out of any menu. And then I remove this widget from the parent. The change control screen is no longer there. I'm not just hiding it, I'm actually removing it. Last thing, after that last listen for input action, I call move selection with direction 0 and play sound effects false. This will automatically highlight the initial result, so the jump input key selector, but it won't play a sound effect. So when we come into the menu, it'll look like the first value is highlighted without doing any weirdness where it's playing a sound every time you enter the menu. Nothing like that. Now we have to cover this confirm selection. So you can go ahead and make a new function and call it confirm selection. Now in this episode, like I told you, I'm not going to be going over all of confirm selection. So let's just get the function started by implementing the back button so you know it works. In the next episode of the controller remapping widget, we will go over making the input key selectors work off of this as well. So in your function, we're going to call determine widget to focus, that function we made earlier that returns the widget that we are currently over top of. And once we know what widget that is, we can compare it to specific widgets to then perform the correct operation. So right now we're only using the back button, so I'm going to do a direct comparison to the back button by typing equal, equal. Then we're going to select equal object and pass the back button into this. So if the widget that we found to be selecting is the back button, this branch will return true. And then we want to call the P1 back event that we set up in the event graph. So if I press my actual confirm button while the back button is selected, I will do the back operation. That was a mouthful, but I'm glad all that is done. Now the crouch did not exist in the previous episode, but I have not bound this yet. We'll go over binding these and, like I said, using the confirm button to actually be able to map these without using the mouse in the next episode. But for now, this will be good. There was a lot going on, and these menu navigation episodes are always pretty heavy. But you should now be able to go into your settings. You can press Shift F1 to make your mouse visible if it isn't already, and then you can go to your selectors and change to your controls menu. At this point, you should be able to navigate using your custom menu navigation inputs. You should be able to press confirm on any of them. You won't see anything happen unless you press it on the back button, and then you should exit the menu. But at that point, guys, you should be good to go, and you will be free to map your controls if you'd like to. That's all I got for today, guys, so thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do. I just really appreciate it. I want to give another shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for the love and support. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. There's a link in the description. It is completely free, and I'd be happy to assist you, get you sorted so you can continue working on your game. Anyway, guys, like I said, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.